Okay, great. Well, welcome everybody to the second of our sessions on implementation science. So some of you may have been in the first session, but some of you might not. So just to remind you, this is a collaboration between two of the working groups in CATS, Working Group 5, which Yuda and I lead, and Working Group 7, which is led by Natalie and Kirstine. And we're really excited to talk today about more about implementation science. And last time we went for the kind of pre-study focus and thinking about planning for implementation in a study. And this time we're going with the messy middle. So this is the kind of stuff that might happen in the middle of a project that's ongoing. So next slide, please, Yuda. And just to say that you will, so we are recording, you will have access to the video afterwards. Yuda can give you that if you email her, and the slides as well will be available. So yeah, so that's what we did last time. So November was about planning, sort of pre-study, and you can contact Yuda for access to the recording for that one. And really excitingly, our third and final session is going to be in person in Iceland at the Nordic, or just before the Nordic Aphasia Conference. So we're really looking forward to that, and we hope that some of you will be able to join us. And that one will be about issues kind of after studies have been conducted. Okay, so our learning objectives for the end of this speaker series are that you will be able to define what implementation science is, select a framework for implementation science that works for you. So this is very much about the practicalities of making this accessible to you in the work that you're doing. You will feel that you're able to apply that framework to your own work and reflect on how you could bring implementation into your research more generally. And also we're aiming to help you to find the resources you need to carry on with this kind of work. So for today then, what we're going to do is dive much more deeply into implementation for two communication partner training programs. So we've decided to illustrate all of this implementation work through talking about CPT, which is a really strong thread of work within CATS Working Group 5 that Yuda and I are both involved in. So our examples are going to come from CPT programs. And what we're going to do is apply some of the frameworks for implementation science to each of our two CPT programs and that work. So I'm going to talk about better conversations with aphasia, and then we're going to apply the theoretical domains framework to that work and that study. And then the other example comes from Yuda's work, which is COMTIL, the intervention training for healthcare professionals across Denmark to upskill them as communication partners for people with aphasia. And we're going to use the IPARIS framework and something called FRAME to apply to COMTIL, so that we can give you some very practical examples of how you might use those. And then we're going to leave some time for discussion, for questions and chat at the end. So that's the plan. So let's get into the first of our CPT programs, which is going to be Better Conversations with Aphasia. So if you can move on to the next slide. Thanks, Yuda. So I'm just going to give you a bit of background to Better Conversations with Aphasia, and not assume that you necessarily know that CPT program. And then we will move on to think about applying the theoretical domains framework to BCA, as I'll call it for short from now. So BCA is a CPT approach that's underpinned by conversation analysis. And I'm really sorry, my phone just keeps going off, so I clearly need to put it on mute. Let me just do that before I carry on. Okay, sorry about that. BCA is one of its key characteristics is that it involves training both the person with aphasia and the conversation partner. So not all CPT approaches do that, but we do in Better Conversations. And the principles behind BCA are based around using video feedback with people. So people make videos at home of their own conversations, and we use those videos. We use them for assessing conversation and also measuring outcomes. But the other key thing we do with those videos is actually within the CPT intervention. So we use them to help people identify conversation facilitators and barriers, and think about what those might be and might mean for them. And we use the videos to help people practice strategy use. So once they've decided maybe what the barriers are in their conversations and come up with some goals, so some strategies each to work on. So some for the person with aphasia, some for the conversation partner. There's a lot of practice of using those strategies in conversations. So we don't assume that people, just because they've talked about strategies and identified what would be good ones for them, are going to be able to just slot those into their conversations. We think practice is a really crucial part of this intervention. And the SLT's job is very much facilitative. So facilitating discussions about facilitators and barriers, supporting that practice and offering online prompts to use strategies. And what we know from our initial BCA study is that it significantly reduces barriers to conversation. And this is a group level in the study that we did. And we know at the individual level, for some individuals, it also promotes an increase in their facilitatory conversation behaviours. Next slide, please, Ida. So BCA is linked to an online resource. So the therapy program itself is available online. There's also some CPD learning on that resource, as well as the therapy materials. It's a free resource, which actually has been going for nearly 10 years now. I can't quite believe it's that long since we launched. I just looked the other day and there are 9,700, I think it was 99 actually, users registered. And we can tell from some of the data we get from the back end of the website that approximately 500 users access it every week. And there's a range, a huge number of countries those users are in. And about 60% of our users are in the UK, last time we looked at that. And we have some translations, I should have put / adaptations there as well. So we have the kind of Scandinavian set in terms of our translations of therapy handouts. And there are some others under development, including German and Latin American Spanish. Next slide, please, Ida. So what we're going to talk about today is something the team decided to do, which was to explore the impact of the BCA resource on SLT practice. And we went at this stage for a view of what was happening in the UK and the Republic of Ireland. And really this was driven by my university's research impact agenda. So they were asking questions about, what will our next impact case studies be for the Research Excellence Framework, which is a UK assessment that happens in universities every sort of 5 or so years. And so it seemed like a good idea to do a survey of users. And interestingly, at this point, we weren't really thinking explicitly about implementation. And I'll just leave that there for now, but we'll sort of circle back to this idea later. So we designed an online survey for registered SLT users of the BCA resource who were in the UK and the Republic of Ireland. And you can see there how we distributed it to people to request that they complete it. And we had 48 questions and a range of question types. We collected some demographics about people. We asked about their general use of the resource. And then we asked about some changes in knowledge and confidence and their use of CPT before and after using the resource. And then we also just wanted to know who they were using it with and for what kind of purposes. And we also asked about some of the service level factors that might be impacting on their use of BCA. Some of our respondents only completed 23 questions if actually what they were doing was using the resource more for CPD and not using it with clients or conversation partners. Next slide, please, Ida. So just want to show you some of the data that we did get from that survey. So this is from 32 respondents on the first few 23 questions. So you can just see that I don't need to say too much about this, but you can see something about the respondents in terms of their years of practice. So quite a lot of experienced therapists were responding to the survey. You can see their service or settings. So the largest group of respondents were working in the community. And in terms of the UK job bandings, the majority of them were they weren't newly qualified, but they were at band 6, which is kind of more generalist than specialist, perhaps, is a reasonable way of putting that. And then you can see the respondents by region. So we got most people from London, but not a bad spread. Next slide, please, Ida. So in terms of general use, how often and what were they using BCA for? Actually, what we found is that the majority of people were using it for continuing professional development. So they were using the aspects of the website that were telling them, giving them knowledge about what conversation is, how it works, and what's the impact of aphasia on conversation. But there were 41% of them who were using the resource and the our therapy package to tailor make therapy. So in effect, they were taking our therapy program and adapting it for their own setting. Next slide, please, Ida. And then we asked them about the tools that were in the resource and how frequently they were using it. Can you just click again, Yuda? So yeah, great. So these are the modules that we found that people were using either frequently or moderately. So they were looking at what is conversation like when you have aphasia, which has got lots of video clips of people in conversation. They were using the therapy program, and they were using a module which was about structuring feedback. So it was really about how do you talk to your patients and their family members about this kind of thing. So the kind of nuts and bolts of how you do the therapy, really. Next slide, please, Yuda. And then interestingly, what we found was being used less often, although it was very concrete and was recommending some quite explicit outcome measures, were the modules on measuring outcomes. So for some reason, that wasn't getting as much traffic from our SLTs as some of the other modules. Next slide, please. And then just to give you a flavour of what they were reporting, so before and after using the resource. So there were some really nice results in terms of how people felt about their knowledge and understanding of CPT before and after using BCA. So the green blocks are after. And so we've got most of the green blocking in the excellent and good ratings after using BCA. Next slide, please. So we also asked them about, yeah, that is it, isn't it? Frequency of use of CPT. So basically, after using this resource, were they actually changing their practice and using CPT with their clients more often? And in fact, that did seem to be the case. So again, the size of the green blocks goes up for using CPT most of the time or often after accessing the resource. And then the next one you do. So this is the third of those ratings. So we asked people, how confident do you feel to provide CPT? After accessing the resource, that went up. So we had many more people saying they were very confident or confident after using the resource. So some very positive things there. Next slide, Yuda. And then we asked them, essentially, have you changed your everyday clinical practice as a result of using the BCA resource? 59% of them said they had, and you can see there some of the comments that people gave. Not everybody gave a comment, but we grouped the kind of comments that people left if they did so. So the majority of people were saying the thing they changed was that they considered offering or offered CPT more after using the resource. And then we asked the people who said, no, it hasn't changed our clinical practice, to tell us why they think that is. And there seemed to be a range of different issues there, but for some people it was about their caseload. And you can see some other things that were mentioned just by one respondent each. Next slide, please, Yuda. So service level factors. So these are kind of barriers and enablers to actually using BCA on the ground. I guess it's no great surprise there that time constraints came up as a very significant barrier. But you can see also that attitudes and skills of the client and the CPs was also a fairly significant barrier there. So I'm guessing that's kind of things around maybe the CP not feeling like therapy is about them. Why should they be trained? It's about the person with aphasia and their skills. That's something that seems to be reflected in the feedback we're getting from people. But very positively, some of the enablers to using BCA were around knowledge, skills, and confidence. So, which, since we know that they're reporting that those things are all increasing after using the online resource, it seems like the online resource is enabling the use of BCA. And then there were some other things that people were talking about in terms of the environment they were working in and the support from sort of systems and managerial level. Next slide, please, Ida. So that kind of left us with some challenges that we wanted to explore, and some of those are here. Maybe I'll just highlight the issue about the key barrier seeming to be time constraint. And also, I think it's just what the big thing we learned from doing this survey is that actually there was a real challenge there in balancing the kind of in-depth information we really needed to get from users about what they were using and what for, and actually people getting to complete the survey. So we did get a lot of incomplete responses to the survey, and I think if I did it again, even though I wanted to ask all those questions, I'd have slashed them significantly in terms of the number that we asked people. It was quite a big ask to get people to work through the survey. Next slide, please, Ida. So what we're going to do next is think about how we could apply the theoretical domains framework to BCA to kind of get a grip on what we were learning from that survey and think about it really very explicitly in terms of implementation. So next slide, Yuda. Kirstine, are you able to come in at this point? Yeah, is that okay? I'll
Yeah,
pass over to
yeah,
you.
definitely. Thank you. So, can everyone hear me okay? Good. Um, so what I always find so interesting is when we have these two different perspectives, because I think when I was talking about this with Suzanne, you know, you've done all this great work, but like you said, initially you weren't thinking about implementation. So we have, last time we talked about, you know, this lovely, perfect world where you plan out things from the beginning, but that just doesn't happen all the time. And often we find ourselves doing something else and then realizing actually we've probably got a lot of really good information that can help inform implementation, and maybe we've already been doing it but haven't really realized. So I think, you know, when I come into it with my implementation hat, I can see this, you know, you've already done this, and you've, to me, yes, maybe your survey, you weren't thinking about implementation at the time, but when I look at it, you can easily apply a framework or to the survey that you've already done. So I think, you know, for a lot of people, there's this, I don't know, a perception sometimes that theories need to be applied in a certain way, but you can always use them later on to help inform your understanding of surveys and interviews as well. So this is just an overview slide that we used in the last presentation. I won't talk too much about this framework, but it essentially is a synthesis of a lot of different behavior change theories. So it's a sort of one size fits all, I suppose. It's got a lot of different things within it. And I've found it quite helpful in terms of understanding practice, and then also using that to help design some sort of next steps in developing implementation strategies. So yeah, so it's just got these 14 domains around. And if I just, oh, that's okay. No, we'll go on to the next slide. So if I just sort of wanted to step through some practical sort of steps. So if we look at what Suzanne just showed us from her survey, we've got some really interesting results, but what do we do now? What we can do is think about implementation using this framework, and there's a worksheet that I can point you to, and we can share that around the reference for that, but it's from the Behavior Change Wheel workbook. And essentially it has the list of the domains. Oh, thank you. It has the list of the domains, and it's also linked with the COM-B, but I won't talk about that too much. But if we just look at the theoretical domains in the middle, and then I just went along and looked at what Suzanne had found and just sort of put some crosses, like, you know, okay, these are the things that came up in Suzanne's survey. So we said that knowledge and skills and the confidence, which is the beliefs about capabilities, they were enablers. Post-training, so you know, people had been through the program and there were some things that came up. So I just sort of ticked them. And then the other two, the main barriers that came out from that survey were around time, which falls into the environmental context and resources domain. And then the other one was around the attitudes and skills and beliefs of the communication partners themselves. So when we're looking at the theoretical domains framework, that maps onto the social influences domain. So that's got another tick or cross in this case. So I just sort of showed that worksheet. And then if we move on to the next slide, what do we do now? So we can say, okay, we've got some barriers and we've mapped them to this framework. What do we do? So then we can match them to behavior change techniques, which can then inform our thinking about some strategies to address those barriers. And I've just got a few suggestions here. Again, we can use the Behavior Change Wheel workbook, which is traditionally what I've done. There's some published papers about behavior change techniques from Susan Mickey, So again, we can share around some resources, but in, recent development, which was a very exciting time, I found there's this online tool, which I loved because it's color coded and it's very easy to use. So essentially with this online tool, I'll show you some screenshots in a second, but the link is there. It's just the same as what's in the workbook, but it's just a lot easier because you click on the barrier and it shows you some potential matches for you. So yeah, I thought that was a really good thing to share with everyone, and it's quite easy to use. So if we just go on to the next slide, yeah, I've just got some screenshots. So along the top, they're all the barriers. So like KN is knowledge. If you go to that link and you hover over it, it tells you what they are. So I've just selected the environmental context and resources and the social influences. And then once you click on them, it sort of brings up a lot of colored boxes. So you select those barriers, and then in the next slide, you hide the ones that you don't want to select, and it gives you this really long list, and you just sort of scroll down and have a look and you think, what is this that I'm looking at? But you want to look at the green boxes. So they've done a few studies, and if you look at the website, it will tell you more about them, but they're trying to find the behavior change techniques that have some evidence to support that they can change the barrier that we're talking about. So yeah, if we just go down that environmental context and resources, we can look at the green box, social supports, providing prompts and cues. And I haven't got all of them here because there's a very long list, but another common one is adding objects to the environment. So that's sort of the process that you go through in order to sort of give you that comprehensive overview of what are some potential behavior change techniques and which ones have evidence and which ones are matched to the barriers. So then if you click on the next slide, if you click into any of those boxes that I mentioned, so if you click on the green box, it'll give you some more detail about the evidence supporting that. So they did do some consensus work around that. And you can see with this one, as I said, so adding objects to the environment is looking at how can we address those environmental barriers. So adding extra environmental supports and physical resources. And then you can see that 95% of the experts said, yes, that definitely is appropriate. So if you feel like you're stabbing in the dark, there's some really nice resources for you to look at. And just to note that it doesn't go a lot into what each behavior change technique actually is. So I found that I did have to look somewhere else to read a little bit more. And there's an app as well, which I quite like, just because it's quite easy to search through. And I do get a bit overwhelmed when there's, I don't know, I can't remember how many, but I think there's over 100 behavior change techniques. So that's just another sort of handy tip for you all. But yeah, if we go into the next slide, I just thought I'd show you, last year we had a systematic review published, which was looking at barriers and facilitators to CPT. And what I just really loved was that the ones that I've circled here were the key barriers and enablers that Suzanne picked up in her survey. So we have in the top 7, most common or most frequently identified barriers and enablers or facilitators. We had 5 that Suzanne picked up. So again, it's that, I think, that was quite a small survey, like you said, but it's really showing that these are some common things that are coming up. And I thought that was really interesting. Yeah, so if you go on to the next slide, it was just sort of, it's a bit busy, but this is one of the tables from the paper, the systematic review. And it just sort of shows you the steps that we went through, just to give some more practical examples. Because what happens with the big table is you get this behavior change technique, and then you still need to actually think, well, what does that look like and what does that mean? So for this example about time, which is always the most common barrier that seems to come up with every single practice change, if we went across to the next column, which was the relevant behavior change techniques, we can think about, okay, we can restructure the environment and potentially add objects to the environment. So, but what does that mean? What would that look like? So it could be around service redesign at that service level, or more at the individual level. It could be about persuading clinicians to prioritize, providing CPT as part of their service, and also potentially having speech pathology champions within a team who have that knowledge and can support others. So thinking about, what that might actually look like. And so in that final box down the bottom, there's just a little bit more around sort of how it's some suggestions that we came up with our research team from our experience and from reading a lot of what other people had done, to think about how they might actually do that. So thinking about, I mean, we can't provide more time for clinicians unless we have a lot of money, which nobody does, to fund extra services. So it's really about that distribution of time and the priority that CPT has within a service. And I think, we have talked a lot about how it can match with people's goals, but it needs to be discussed, and potentially at a service level, if there's, support. And this comes back to that issue, Suzanne, of measuring outcomes, because if people aren't showing the benefit of CPT within their service, they may not get support to do it. But if they can show that it's leading to those improved outcomes for people with aphasia, then their service might be more willing to support that as a priority. But yeah, so this was just sort of a nice sort of tie-in, I thought, with all the great work that Suzanne had done. And then we talked about, that's great. Because I said, well, that's all very good. In my mind, I thought, well, that's great. But Suzanne, you've developed, you and your team, BCA, and it's a program that people use. So how can you actually influence the time that people do dedicate to implementing it? And then we had a nice discussion. So maybe you could share some of the things you have been doing, because it turns out you are an implementation expert after all.
Yes, isn't that lovely? I am one and I didn't know it. So as you were talking about those suggested strategies, it was, and this isn't a kind of prepared thing, it's just making me think as I'm listening to you, okay, well, we did that, and those are all, so some of the things we've done to, restructure the environment or add objects to the environment have been like, so one service where a couple of SLTs came on some in-person training that we did for BCA, then went away and put CPT into the care pathway for their stroke community team. So every person with aphasia in their service, they sat down and had a conversation with them about what their wishes and goals were, and they talked through a series of kinds of interventions that they could deliver. That's just the way they worked. But they actually hadn't at that point got CPT on the list. So they got some other things around, word finding and around sentences or whatever, but not CPT. So they added it to the list, which means it gets talked about with every person with aphasia and family that they see, and so people can make their own decisions about whether they want to have CPT or not. And then I was just thinking that Anna Volkmer and Claire Farrington Douglas, who run a CPT clinic at the National Hospital in London, did a really nice leaflet for their service users about what CPT is, and what it involves and why you might want to do it, so the benefits. So that was a way of, I suppose, offering persuasive communication to families, as it says on your slide, Kirstine. And then we've had SLTs who've come on training who have then gone back and kind of, I suppose, a bit more of a informal train the trainer model, where they've cascaded that knowledge to the team, but then also been the go-to person for advice and support with doing CPT. So in a way, being an SLT champion, which I have, since we've been designing the slides for this meeting, decided that we need to be much more explicit about with people. You are our CPT champion for your service, and actually, kind of build that into our training. So there's
Yeah,
lots of lovely ways that I think this makes concrete sense to me, coming at it
yeah,
from the other end.
yeah, exactly. And I think it could be just that next step is formalizing some of those things that you can see are working well, and then trying to embed that. And you could potentially then evaluate that in the next iteration of a future study that you're doing, just to sit alongside if it's something you do add in, then trying to add in at some sort of measure of whether or not that works, and trying to understand for who it works. There's some people who are natural sort of champions of different things, and sometimes that can be more difficult. But yeah, I think that there's some really nice things there to sort of go forward with. So hopefully that's sort of been a nice example to show how some work that's being done, then you can sort of, step back a little bit and say, okay, what now, and how can we think about implementation? Yeah, so that was just my little example with Suzanne looking at the theoretical domains framework.
Thanks, Kirstine. So, I think then we're over to you to talk about COMTIL.
Yes, and I will do that together with Natalie. So I will sort of more stick to the CPT side of this, and then when I need good theoretical explanations, I will say, Natalie, please unmute and start talking. No, maybe I should start saying that we did think about implementation from the beginning when we started to make our Danish CPT program. But not in a very formalized way. I do remember, 6 years ago or something, like 7 years ago, when we were sort of starting on this, I had some students that went out and collected some data where they made video recordings of patients with aphasia in different hospital settings, communicating with different healthcare staff, and they tried to analyze this also by applying some of the TDF framework into it. So we had a little bit sort of that theoretical knowledge in the background, but not very explicit and not using it very actively either. But before I start talking more about all sorts of things, I should tell you what COMTIL is. So this is a generic CPT program, and it's designed for health professionals that communicate frequently with people with aphasia. And it also contains some support materials to use in supporting that health communication. So pictures, alphabet boards, yes/no cards, and things like that. That goes into a personal pack that the person with aphasia will get if it's needed when other people are communicating with them, but it's still the healthcare professional that are responsible for using those materials, and they should be able to do so after having received that training. So it's not about, as Suzanne said, also training and working with the person with aphasia here. It's this generic training model. And we have developed it through co-design with stakeholders. So people with aphasia, family members, and health professionals have been involved. And it's some years ago now, so back in 2017, we got the funding and really started working on this, and ending in by the end of 2020. And sort of the overall aim when we started was to make healthcare accessible for people with aphasia, all the way from acute care out into community care. So imagine that you went into acute care, you met different type of healthcare professionals, and they were trained in the same way to communicate with you. But when you went to rehab or out into the community to receive outpatient care and rehabilitation, all had been trained by that same model, and all were using the same training materials. I can reveal to you it never happened that well, but some of it happened. But that was the idea. And it was developed for a very local context. So where I live on the west coast of Denmark, there is an acute hospital, and then there is a rehab hospital 80 kilometers or 70 kilometers away, where you are usually transferred to get your still sort of inpatient, but rehabilitation, not acute care. And then there are 5 surrounding municipalities that send their citizens that get a stroke to this hospital or to those 2 hospitals. So that was sort of the very local setting. So we have this change in Denmark, as many other places, that you change sectors. It's the regions of Denmark running the hospitals and the municipalities that run all kinds of care as soon as you are out of hospital. And we were building our program on existing evidence from programs like SCA out of Canada. And the model is a train-the-trainer model. So we have been training trainers, and the trainers have then gone out to train. Often they're more close colleagues, but we also have other trainers. For instance, our SLT trainers that will go out into a care home or a different institution where they are not necessarily based, but where they can come and train and go back to their SLT clinic again. And as I have written at the bottom of the slide, so trainers can have other professional backgrounds than SLTs. And that's probably one of the only programs that have been experimenting with that. But the idea is that if you are a trainer and you go out and do what we call the basic training, then you are ideally being trained 2 times 3 hours with some weeks between, and focus on sort of a very varied training, so lectures, videos, role plays, reflection time, group discussion. We would have loved, and that was also a finding from our co-design, to have been able to practice with people with aphasia, but that was simply not feasible. I still say that to new trainers that come and attend the training, but many will need to stick with role plays. But it's very important that they practice the different strategies and tools that they learn. So the trainers are sent home with like a different materials at hand, the videos, the slides, and role plays. But as I've also said in relation to the role play, we encourage that they adapt the role plays to a specific local context. And I think nowadays, and we will talk a bit more about that, that we say, please go back and adapt other things as well, as long as it makes sense into your context. But there's also some issues related to that we'll discuss later, because how much can you adapt and still sort of be trust your own evidence, or the evidence we sort of created when we did the projects. So, Natalie.
Yes. No, this is really great. And I am so excited, and as I'm listening to this background information from both Suzanne and Jutta, and then Christine's comments, it's fascinating to me to see how I think clinical researchers really do think about implementation, be that explicit or not, because the whole impetus behind clinical research is to get it implemented, right? And so it's ironic in a way that some of these implementation models are so complex. When you start to break them down, it's, wow, I was doing that, or I did think about that, but I think the initial presentation of a lot of these models potentially makes them unusable, which is another implementation problem. But hopefully you'll see some overlap between this integrated promoting action on research implementation and health services framework and the theoretical domains framework that Christine spoke about. So we also briefly talked about this during the first presentation, and I'm not sure about this swirly diagram, how helpful it is, but the IPARIS model essentially says that if we want our practice to be implemented, it's all about facilitation, making it easy. So facilitation is a function of characteristics of the innovation or the intervention itself, the recipients and the providers of that intervention, and then the context. And we know that context is everything when it comes to implementation. So we've got context at the most local level, we've got context at the organizational level, we've got the external context even outside of that when we think about how probably in each of the countries represented here, reimbursement for communication partner training is different, and we know that that drives service provision. So it's all of these different aspects, but at the end of the day, we have to make it easy. And that's what facilitation is all about. So if we want to go to the next slide, we can talk a little bit about you know, how, and you know, I don't know if you want to talk about this, but you really did already do a lot of this work right at the very beginning.
Yeah. For sure, we really wanted to study what's in that IPARIS swirly model. Sorry, I can't change now. So we wanted to know, to get to know our recipients, and the recipients, of course, is sort of a twofold here. We train healthcare professionals, but actually it's also people with aphasia and family members that are recipients, but in a much more sort of indirect way, since they don't receive the actual training. And then there's the context, and as the model and Natalie also said, it can be that very local context, but it's also the whole sort of organizational level and political level and all sorts of contexts that people are a part of, and then the CPT evidence. And so we surveyed all that, or not surveyed, just we made observations, we made interviews, we dug into the literature and so forth. And then we started doing the collaborative work with the stakeholders. And I guess we also, we thought that we had full support from management at different levels. When I'm thinking back of who was in that steering committee on the project, it was so powerful. It was the health directors of the different municipalities. It was the head consultant of the stroke ward and so forth. And they were sitting there and nodding until they found out, oh, it's actually my staff that will be trained. And oh, I need to prioritize this into my organization. And even though we had money on the grant to pay people out of their work for a full day workshop or whatever, it was still a surprise and ended up being a big barrier, at least in some contexts. Not all municipalities, but some of them. So I guess we had our sort of pre-study implementation naive thought, I think I should say, was this assumption that if we know and work with the people who need the intervention and the indirect receivers of the intervention, then we must face less barriers. And somehow it is true, but it's also naive to think that if I know the context, if I know my recipients, if I know the evidence and so forth, then we can make a smashing intervention and we will all succeed. I think we are experiencing exactly the same barriers that all other projects and health professionals are perceiving as well. Well, maybe no, maybe a little bit less. I don't know. On a good day, I think it's less.
Yeah. And so when we think about, what is facilitation according to the IPARIS model? So this is out of some work done in the Veterans Administration in the States. And I like this definition of facilitation. So thinking about it as a process of interactive problem solving and support. And there is this kind of baseline level of a need for improvement, right? So there has to be like this tension for change to a degree to where the people, the leaders at that organizational level that Yuta was talking about, they have to feel that tension of, oh, probably people with aphasia are not getting the best care possible, to kind of drive that change. And then there's also this foundational principle of having a supportive interpersonal relationship to drive these changes. And I think when we have these discussions about champions, we know that when that champion can really be embedded in the local context and be a respected member of that community and not an outsider, that would be considered an internal facilitator. And that can really drive, I think, some of this forward. So we can go on to the next slide. So facilitation really can be, it's a person or people, and it's a process or structure, right? Especially when we think about the IPARIS model. So it can be internal or external to where the implementation is taking place, or some level of both. But when we think about activities such as project management or quality improvement activities, there's a lot of overlap here with facilitation and figuring out how to use local data to embed change and to sustain that change over time. So aspects of team building, aspects of persuasion, as Christine said earlier, with the TDF, and being able to influence and negotiate change, these are all aspects of facilitation as well. We'll go to the next slide.
Yes, sorry, I'm trying to multitask here and look at the comments and speak and do the slides. Sorry about that. So it's not that I want to tell you a lot about the efficacy of COMTIL. We measured by using the health professionals and aphasia questionnaire. With this survey, it's a 16-item survey. It's self-reported. The health professional have been rating themselves pre-training approximately 8 weeks after, and then 1 year after. And as you can say, it looks good. I mean, they thought they were pretty good at communicating with people with aphasia already, which I'm glad. I hope that's true, and I also hope it's true that the training made them better. And what I especially like is that they think they are also good a year after, because that's often what we see. Then you tend to forget, and then you'll rate yourself lower. But anyhow, I also want to mention some of the anecdotal evidence that we got and we still get. I have been training COMTIL trainers this January this year. And I have been speaking to new trainers from the hospitals that went into this first project, and I can hear that it has been quite successful, especially in those 2 hospitals. So it's standard procedure now. When you are employed in one of those 2 wards, you get the training. There's also a lot of implementation regarding who gives that material pack, and that there is assign in the patient file that this person needs to be communicated with in a supported way. So there's like our COMTIL symbol is in the electronic patient file and so forth. So yes, COVID interfered with many plans, and I guess many plans, especially out in the municipality, but especially the 2 hospitals look quite good. But I also think there is a difference there, even though it's exactly the opposite of an old study by Nina Simons-Maggie and colleagues back from 2007, where they have studied acute rehab and I think it was some kind of care home setting where the staff had been trained in using SCA. And that was the other way around. So the worst setting to do the implementation was acute and the best was care home. And I think ours is exactly the opposite around. But I think, and that's only my thought, that the municipality settings is much more complex. You can be, for instance, an SLT in a Danish municipality, and you can train sort of your own very sort of local colleagues, but you can also go out 50 kilometers away and train in a care home, and then you say goodbye, and then you don't see them until you have a patient maybe there half a year after or something like that. So this talk we just had about the champions might be an issue there, that if you don't get a real local facilitator and champion, then it's really hard to maintain what you have been training the staff to do out there. And I think what has especially made COMTIL successful in that acute hospital where we did the training back in 2019 or 18 or whenever it was that the nurse and the nursing assistant that had been doing most of the training there, they are just excellent champions, and they continue to put pressure on the management that we need to train, and now it's time to do something again. And yes, they have been stressed out by the pandemic as well, and there might have been a short slip for a year or something, but they're back on again, they're training again now. And yeah, it's just interesting to hear those stories even long time after you develop this intervention. But we have also been using the COMTIL train the trainer model beyond the core project here. So in collaboration with CATS and the World Federation for Neurorehabilitation, Suzanne and Caroline Diego and Annalisa Pais got the chance to train a very multi-country group. So we have been training trainers online in India and Egypt. Egypt/Colombia is because some of the Egyptian members were from Colombia, so they have done translations both to Spanish and to Arabic. And in Austria and Serbia and Greece. And currently I'm also doing an online course in Iceland. And we also continue to train trainers in Denmark, and I also have the chance every second year to give the trainer course to master students here that selected as and yeah, it's an elective course here. So it lives, but today the focus is now much more on the daily implementation. And we have been discussing that a lot amongst us when preparing our different sessions here on implementation science, that I don't feel very science-like when I talk implementation. I feel like I'm standing with my feet in the mud because I train nursing assistants and SLTs on the ground that go home and start using the tool the day after. And they can make it a research project, but most of them choose not to and just go out and use it in their daily context. So we continue to make small adaptations to the train the trainer model and also to the basic training model based on our own, but also the trainer's feedback. And I must say, I have especially had a very renewed focus on implementation, because that is what keeps on coming back to us. Yes, this is all good, but when I go back, this is so hard to do. So yeah, I'm also learning a lot right now by working with Suzanne and Natalie and Kirstine, and we made quite a few adaptations to the course we did here in January, and what I'm sharing with the Icelandic team next week when we complete the Icelandic course. But when talking about this, Natalie pulled up a model. I can say she pulled up this model when we met earlier this week, and Suzanne and I were like, but that's the model we are using in COMTIL International. I think, Natalie, you said something like, okay, the bad thing is we need another model to explain what you are talking about. And then she showed us this model, and we could say, but that's FRAME, that's the model we have been using already. Because the stage that COMTIL is in now, when we go out and start doing training in other contexts, is that we do less, a much smaller train the trainer program. Like here in Denmark, we have people for 4 full days face to face. We can't do 4 full days online, then we will all be dead by the end of day 1. So we meet 5 times, 2 hours, and then we work, or the country groups that we worked with when we had like that sort of multi-country group, they worked between the meetings, and then the big emphasis was also on adapting the training into not just the right language, but also the right culture as much as possible. So we have been using a model for the language adaptation, and then this frame for the modifications more in relation to the culture, but also to register what we have been changing language-wise. Yes, yeah. Natalie.
Yes. So one of the things that we kind of realized as we were working on this talk was kind of looping back to the IPARIS model. A key facilitator to successful implementation of the COMTIL really is this adaptation piece, and being able to have such a strong understanding of the local context and be able to adapt it to certain needs. And I think that when we start talking about intervention adaptation, it can make intervention scientists feel maybe a little itchy and afraid, because it's an intervention that has been studied in a particular way, usually with some amount of fidelity, so that of course we want consistency and we want standard procedures, but we also know the reality of clinical service provision, especially when we're talking about crossing international borders and the many different levels of context. We simply, it won't work to just drop things in as they are. So the frame is really a tool to help us be more cognizant about these adaptations. And I think on the one hand, you could use it as a research tool, but you could also use it as a more practical tool. So I know that that figure, at least to me, is a tad overwhelming when you're looking at the fine print. But essentially what the frame is doing is asking you to think about, one, kind of when are you making this adaptation, right? So in some cases, I think we know before we're even going to try implementation in a different context, we already know we need to adapt it, right? So that would be kind of a pre-adaptation. Sometimes we have to adapt during, right, due to a practical consideration, or we just realize this isn't working. Sometimes we adapt after the fact. So thinking about when these adaptations are occurring, and then thinking about the rationale behind the adaptation. So why why did you do it? Was it to improve cultural fit? Was it to decrease cost, to increase satisfaction? And again, I think the figure in the frame is so complex because there's so many reasons why we might do something. So are we modifying the intervention itself? Are we modifying the context? Who said we need to modify it, right? Is this coming from up above, like a managerial situation where you're being told to adapt it? Or is it something where the community, or maybe a person that's more directly involved in the care, is saying, hey, you know, when we do it this way, it just doesn't work, but if we tweak it this way, it would work. And so I think if we lived in an ideal scenario, what we would do is track these adaptations, and it would be an iterative process, and we would go back and study them, right? We would go back and maybe gather more of that empirical data that we're all wanting. Sometimes that might be appropriate. Sometimes that's not necessary if the main goal of the project is to implement change on the ground. But I think a first step is having some careful documentation of these adaptations, and we can learn so much, right? As opposed to saying only, you know, there was therapist drift, they didn't follow the model. It's like, well, therapists are doing that for a reason, right? They're not just saying, well, I think I'm gonna mess with this program and not do it the way that Yuta said. There's a reason behind it, and the more that we can document that, the more that we can learn. All right, and I'm not sure what we've got on the next slide there. Oh yeah, so there's the frame, and we have the reference in there for you. Oh yeah, so these are some modifications that you all have already made, right, Yuta?
Yeah, that was the process wasn't completed at that time. We got the chance to submit like a little commentary for a journal issue related to the UN Sustainable Developmental Goals. So we are talking about partnerships here and how to partner up between countries for some different health benefits. So we went back at that point where the adaptation and translation was not fully completed, and asked our different country teams, so what have you been adapting? So you can have a look at it yourself, but it's really everything from Austria and Serbia, talking about the sort of the more direct language we use in Danish and English was not very appropriate. We should be more sort of polite in the language, or they should be, when they were addressing colleagues and other health professionals. To Egypt, where it would be nice that the images didn't look as Scandinavia as ours did. And it has just been so interesting to see how we were all thrilled here in Denmark, how we finally got Danish training videos, how we finally got pictures where people had blonde hair and looked quite Scandinavian. And then all of a sudden, it ends up in Egypt. Egypt, of course, with the same criticism that we have been using the SCA materials that we got from Canada, that the videos weren't right and the materials weren't right and all sorts of things. So have a look at it yourself if you are interested. Sorry. And I just had a few reflections here at the end in relation to that specific international projects that Suzanne and I had with other people. And one of them was that CPT, and here in relation to CPT of trained staff or of staff, have lots of benefits for people with aphasia, but the need for CPT might have different origins. We were actually being contacted by the World Federation for Neurorehabilitation, especially from countries where they don't have very good SLT services. So sort of the whole impetus for translating this material and training staff in Egypt or in India might be very different compared to why we do it in Denmark. We maybe do it in Denmark because we would like that patients can make their own decisions or be involved in shared decision making. Whereas in India, it's about someone knowing a tiny little bit about aphasia. Well, India might not be the best. I think they still have a low ratio of SLT per person living in India. But still, yeah, that was the point. And then I guess what is really good is this train the trainer model. And I know other programs, including the SCA, have the same model, but it really contributes to sustainability. Like if Suzanne and myself and other colleagues, we have been logging on and we have been training a few hundred people somewhere, and that was it, then they were not able to train on. But by training 25 people from 6 different countries, then they are able to, like, it can ripple or it will be a ripple that will spread into those countries, or potentially it can be. And then I think it is really ideal to let local teams work on adaptions. And it also makes that sort of both macro and micro adaptions possible. And even when I train Danish trainers, we talk about adaptions. Oh, well, maybe it's hard to do. And it's also a point here that my last bullet point, time is a big issue. It was a big issue in the countries we worked with. It's also a big issue here in Denmark. So maybe you are not able to do 2 times 3 hours. So what can you do then? I have colleagues here in Denmark that has been experimenting with as little as 45 minutes. But of course, it's not the same training. It can't have the same impact. Or I guess it doesn't have the same impact. I'm not sure they have measured, or I am sure they haven't measured that. But we don't know what the consequences are of all this adaptation. I think the adaptations are great, and I think we should be very open to it also as researchers when we do something. But at the same point, we then face some other challenges. So as Natalie said, the trainers or the SLTs are not changing because they want to not do what we have said, but they change it because they need to change it for some reason that they know of, but that we might be unaware of. So this sort of whole issue, and I can see it has been a little bit in the chat as well. So what is core of the training? And I could say something about what I think is core in COMTEL, but I must admit, I actually don't know, because we haven't looked that detailed into that. I think like we had a discussion in the Danish new group that we trained there back in January, and my co-trainer, she was telling me about that they have tried this 45 minutes and what they have sort of cut out. And the thing they had cut out was the role plays. And I was like, no, not the role plays. They need to practice that. So, I mean, that was core for me, but it might not be core in that context. But I was getting a little bit worried. But that's how it is when your baby grow up. You let them loose, and yeah. Says a woman that doesn't have any children. So, Natalie, do you want to say anything before we have time to?
No, I just think this is a great opportunity for having any discussion that people might want to have. There's some great work or comments in the chat. So we have some time. If people, you can feel free to unmute and we can have a conversation.
And Kirstine, you are still awake.
One of my children is still awake. Oh no, both. Oh, I don't know. Anyway.
Well, thank you very much. I was really chatting away because of all the recognition I get from the work we do in the Netherlands, which was lovely. And so it was nice to feel backed up by our, by what you guys are finding and describing and what we do. We seem to be a bit separate because we're not really linked to like the COMTIL as such, but what we do here is very similar, as is with PACT, as it's called in the Netherlands, which is very similar to BCA, albeit still in a paper format. So it's good to sort of appreciate and still take, making a lot of scribbles of how to proceed as well. So that was great. Yeah.
And can I ask you, I think, Sandra, I saw you wrote something about when the work you have also been doing about providing contacts in your rehab center, and I think you wrote something like, we aren't that close to the developers.
Yes.
So how do you do that sort of whole translating it into your session? Something from other people that you might have done things differently. So do you do that now?
Yes. So Feline Berns, who is one of the authors of Contact in the Netherlands, in the Dutch setting, applying SCA, it's very much like it was, the two train the trainer. We all had the train the trainer course by her, so all speech therapists. And then we provide the training to healthcare staff. But because we were sort of a pilot or testing ground, we sort of confronted our managers with this, right, we're going to do this. This is very important, which is a bit tricky and a bit naughty, I guess. But they fully agreed, and they fully, because some of them are doctors and they have, I feel their stomach rumbling when they are in front of a person with aphasia as well. But I also recognize, right, now we have a new manager. This is right. This is taking a bit too much time. She's not having the urgency or the importance of communication and what the problems are. So that's when we adapted the first session of training, which we provide here locally, into an e-learning program. There fortunately was some money to do that, so it's quite professional. So they have a first basic understanding of the principles and what the strategies are that they are supposed to be using, with lots of video materials. And then we only have one practice session of 3 hours in which we do use persons with aphasia. So we have some people from the aphasia center who like to come in, and we have some who've become, patients from here who have become sort of volunteers to come back to do the training. And sometimes we use persons with aphasia which are here in the clinic at that time. And that is very much appreciated. So I did write down, yes, role play is key, is cool. Yeah, does that answer your question? It was a bit lengthy.
No, it was great. It was great. Thank you. Leslie?
I've been in Zoom for ages. I don't know, lower hands. I'm so much used to Teams now that I'm forgetting. I just a few comments. My name's Leslie and I'm based in Scotland, and I'm not an SLT. But I'm so pleased and thanks. It's so nice to be here. But it seems that there's a common theme that a lot of us are using e-learning as implementation strategies or training, or how do we start the ball rolling? And I too have developed online learning or an online training resource to support person-centered goal setting practice. So we seem to be a community that's doing a lot of the same thing as one of the first things. Another common thing that came through is that the first round of feedback I got on the training that I developed was, your training's great and we kind of get goal setting. It's something that we get, but what's really hard is implementing this in our local teams. And I think that's a theme here. And so we had to include a whole section on implementation. I realised that training just wasn't about this is goal setting, this is person-centred. It was, hey, how do you need to think this through in your local setting? And that's as big a part of it. The other theme that was coming through was about adaptions, and I've created all sorts of resources to support person-centred goal setting practice, and without exception, every single setting wants to change the resource. And so, and then you get a bit like, oh, stick to the basic, you know, stick to the principles. But my attitude is you just have to let folk do it and then see how it goes. So that's another common theme coming through. Two last thoughts. Theoretical domains framework. I get that and understand that. I've gone much more towards normalization process theory and thinking about, because a lot of the barriers I've found is context, leadership, competing demands, rather than things intrinsic within the therapists themselves. So that's just a comment. And that I think that was the main things. But just I don't have a question, it's just some comments. And oh, the last thing, impact, capturing impact of training. I might catch up with you, Suzanne, or reach out to anybody. How do we blooming well capture impact for these ref impact case studies? And you know, you can set things up that people have to register, and you gather some basic demographics. And I would, if anybody would like to help me with that, I would really love to hear from somebody. So that was just some comments and a plea at the end.
Yeah, it is a real challenge, Leslie. And actually, what they didn't want our BCA impact case study in the end because they said the data was too soft. So, you know, impact, asking people if it had changed their practice wasn't what they wanted. They basically wanted it in nice guidelines, and you know, perhaps they wanted to know, you know, like data numbers. They wanted numbers basically. So I still haven't solved that one.
Disappointing.
Yeah, it was disappointing to the point where I kind of thought, oh well, if that's the case, I'm shelving that. So I haven't picked it up again, but I do need to. Sorry, Sandra.
Yeah, sorry. I was just thinking, do you think patient-reported outcome measures could be helpful there? Because you know, obviously there's a lot of awareness and maybe change, but it's how they feel about, you know, how they communicate now, they're feeling supported, blah, blah, blah. It's sometimes maybe a bigger finding than actual change in behavior, which may be subtle, which, well, you know, the whole problem of catching change. Yeah, but maybe more like prompts might be a way forward in that, you know, so they get their figures, and I don't know what it's like. Yeah.
And I think it comes back to Kirstine's point about you just made me think about that kind of outcome measurement, you know. So we found people weren't really accessing that part of our resource. Every time we train people, any kind of contact we have, it's always about, I just don't know how to measure this stuff, or it doesn't fit with the measures I'm expected to use. It's a constant issue. But Kirstine, I was really struck by what you said about, you know, if the outcome measurement is not something that people were comfortable with, or, you know, they're not doing it, then they haven't got the data to drive the change, because they haven't got the evidence which says, look, we need to be doing this, let's change the system. And I kind of hadn't joined up that thought process. So I've already just made a couple of notes to myself. We're doing our next Better Conversations conference in November, and we always do some free workshops the day before, and I'm thinking that probably we should focus on implementation and adaptations for your setting, but also just try and get people a bit more comfortable with an outcome measure that they could use, and then have some data to argue the case for getting CPT on the table more regularly for people. So yeah, I think those are my thoughts. But Leslie, it's really nice to actually meet you, because I've got your goal setting stuff is on my horizon. I haven't yet engaged with it, but goal setting is something that is really core to our communication partner training, and we've been experimenting a bit with gas, but we're kind of looking around now for we need to make some decisions about how we train people to set goals for CPT, and so we're going to look at other resources before we make some decisions. So I might come back and have a conversation with you about that.
Well, maybe I could help you and you could help me.
Yeah, exactly. Sounds good, doesn't it? Yeah. Yeah. Oh yes, Natalie's saying, Leslie, could you put a few references to your work in the chat? You've got a website, haven't you?
Well, I think I'll just put I've got a GCU website and the references are listed.
Yeah,
so
that's what I was looking at. Yeah.
I'll go and find it just now and put it in there.
That would be great. Yes, audit data, Kirsty. Yeah, that was my thought there about the kind of,
because I think impact is so hard to show, and also change is just hard to measure, and it's you get self-report data, and audit data is not perfect either, obviously, because people need to document, and for goal setting, what do you document to show that it's person-centered or collaborative, and how do you, what we find is people document their provided communication partner training, but maybe they have given them a handout of strategies instead of actually training communication strategies. If we're talking about carers. So
yes,
I mean, it's not perfect, but I think if that is something in the UK that's captured with the national audit program, what I'm trying to do in Australia, it's not really happened yet, but I'm working at it, is trying to partner with the Stroke Foundation to look at the key gaps for aphasia, you know, the evidence practice gaps, which are the key ones that we're actually not measuring, but we have a fair idea there's gaps there. So we need to measure the gaps to then focus on improving the gaps. And if it's around things like providing information or communication partner training, we need to get it into our audit program so that people in the site know that they're accountable for doing it.
Yeah.
You know, which like, you know, they do their head CT or their MRI or, you know, all of the care pathway, but there's very little that they actually measure in regards to aphasia practice. And I know that they measure goal setting in Australia, but they're only measuring that goals were set. They're not measuring that it was collaborative or person-centered goals. So maybe that's an option in the long term to sort of work with those bodies.
That's a really good thought. You're making me think about the Sentinel Stroke National Audit Programme, which happens in the UK. We measure how well stroke care is being delivered. I don't even know how well that drills down into aphasia, let alone what's being done. But clearly that's something I should be much more familiar with. So that's another note to myself. Yeah. But yeah, I agree. If we could implement something like that, that would help. But audit data also, I've thought that I should explore with, you know, maybe even kind of pilot it with one service where we've got some very active champions, and just explore, you know, what kind of stuff they're recording and what we could audit and whether there's any useful information there. Yeah, I think that could be a really useful thing to do.
Yes.
Yeah. Sorry, I know we're about to go over, but just in terms of impact, like you could look at the sites that you've trained or have had training and use your resources potentially, and then look at the sites like as a control that haven't had that training, and then do a comparison as well. So that look at that bigger scale, but that's just something I've looked at a little bit, because we actually do have hospital performance measures as well. Anyway.
Yeah.
But sorry.
Yeah,
I know we've gone
really
over.
Thank you. Yeah. I'll think about that.
Sorry, I was just leaving. I'm having visitors now, so we need to say goodbye. No, thank you very much for attending this, and I'm sure that many others will look at it afterwards as well. And if anyone else have not learned anything, I have learned a lot from attending today. And
too.
thank you for interacting with us here and also in the chat.
Yeah.
And have a good
Everyone.
day or good night to some of you.
Bye.